What's the one thing you'd say to your younger self before your first betrayal?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The people who spent my entire life preaching responsibility, lecturing me about making the smart choice, and reminding me how actions have consequences, turned around and asked me to risk my own credit score to clean up the mess my younger brother made after they literally gifted him a house. And the part that still stuns me is that they said it with straight faces, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like family obligation automatically meant sacrificing my financial future because my brother forgot that mortgages come with due dates. Let me start with the house. When my parents called us together, they acted like they were revealing some historic announcement. They handed Luke a set of shiny keys and told him this was his chance to finally build stability, that they wanted him to have the foundation every young man needed. They said he had potential, but just needed a push. I sat there smiling, clapping along, even though a thought kept burning through my head: no one ever gifted me anything close to that. My entire college was paid for with loans under my name, with years of payments ahead, but Luke got handed property like it was a graduation card. Still, I told myself not to ruin the moment. Maybe, just maybe, he would take it seriously and prove us all wrong. Of course, within months the predictable started happening. The first late payment showed up, then an HOA violation because he left trash cans out for days. Then a city notice arrived about unpermitted short-term rentals because his girlfriend decided they could make extra cash by listing the house online. Instead of building stability, Luke was already stacking penalties. And then, right on cue, my parents came to me with that familiar tone they've always used when Luke finds trouble: soft voices, tired eyes, words dripping with guilt trips. They told me Luke's credit would be ruined if someone didn't step in, and since I was good with money, I should take out a temporary consolidation loan in my name to cover the late fees and get the mortgage back on track. I cannot explain how surreal it felt to sit there, hearing them say it as if it were just common sense. They weren't asking him to take responsibility. They weren't telling him to tighten his spending. They weren't reminding him of all the chances he had already burned through. No, they were looking straight at me, their oldest daughter, the one who had never asked for anything, and basically telling me I was the backup plan. I didn't argue or yell. I simply asked for everything in writing. If this was so necessary, then I wanted all the numbers, all the dates, all the amounts. They looked at me like I had just insulted them, like family trust was supposed to be enough. My father gave me one of his classic lines about, "We don't need contracts in this house," while my mother muttered about me being dramatic. I stayed calm, but inside I was boiling. I knew exactly what this was: another chapter in the same old story, where I was the dependable one who carried the weight while Luke stumbled from one mistake to another. That night I went to the bank and spoke with the loan officer, Mr. Alvarez, who patiently explained every single detail I already suspected. If I took out the loan, it would go on my credit report. If I co-signed, I would be just as responsible as Luke. If he missed payments, it would destroy my credit, not his. And once my name was on it, there was no way to separate myself without paying it off completely. In plain English, if I said yes, I would be gambling my financial future on a man who couldn't even pay his HOA fines on time. When I left the bank, I drove straight home and froze my credit. That was my first quiet act of rebellion. I knew my parents would keep pushing, and I wanted to make sure there wasn't a single way they could pressure me into something behind my back. By the time I sat down with them again, I had already decided on my move. If they wanted me involved, fine, but it would not be on their terms. So when they brought it up again, I leaned back, let them spill their lines about family pulling together and temporary solutions, and then I calmly said I was willing to help, but only with a signed repayment plan that included collateral. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lose control. I just let the word collateral hang in the air like smoke. My brother smirked like I was joking. My mother's eyes widened. My father shifted in his chair, clearly caught off guard. For once, I wasn't the dependable daughter quietly nodding along. I was the one setting the terms, and they hated it. That was the moment the balance shifted. They had come expecting a safety net, but what they found was someone ready to play by rules they never thought I'd use. And as they sat there trying to process what I had just said, I realized something I didn't need to scream to make my point. All I had to do was hold the line. If family was so solid, I told them, then they wouldn't mind putting the house itself up as security. The silence that followed my demand for collateral was heavier than any shouting match we had ever had, and for the first time in my life, my father did not have a lecture ready, my mother did not have a guilt-soaked monologue prepared, and my brother did not have a cocky comeback waiting on his lips. They looked at me as if I had just flipped the table over, not with violence, but with a kind of authority none of them expected me to ever claim, because for years I had been the reliable one, the one who bent rather than broke, the one who found a way to patch the holes so the family ship kept floating, while Luke was free to stumble and still be forgiven. And now, after I had calmly suggested that if family was so solid then the house should stand as security for any deal involving my credit, the three of them suddenly understood that I was no longer sitting in the chair they had carved for me years ago. My father, Mark, tried to recover first, straightening in his seat and adopting his favorite voice of reason, the same one he had used when explaining why Luke's impulsive choices were actually entrepreneurial spirit and why my sacrifices were just part of being the strong one. He told me that in families, trust was more important than paperwork, that legal language was unnecessary when blood bound us together. But I had lived long enough to know that in our family, trust always meant I carried the risk while Luke carried none, so I looked him in the eye and repeated that if they wanted me to help, then everything would be written, signed, and secured, because I had grown tired of verbal promises that dissolved the second things got uncomfortable. My mother, Diane, went the other direction. She leaned in with watery eyes, soft voice, and words about how families fall apart when we let money take center stage, reminding me that she had always believed I was the peacemaker, the glue that held everyone together. She said this was my chance to prove that I was bigger than selfishness, that I could rise above pettiness and step in for my brother because, after all, you're the one who can handle it. It was the same script I had heard since childhood, the same manipulation disguised as praise, the same expectation that I should feel proud of being used because it proved I was dependable. And this time, instead of absorbing it, I let the silence hang, forcing her to see that the words no longer worked on me. Luke, meanwhile, laughed in disbelief, as if the idea of him signing anything that could hold him accountable was absurd, telling me that I sounded like a bank officer, not a sister. He thought mocking me would pull me back into the role of the uptight, over-serious sibling who always got blamed for being rigid while he got excused for being careless. But I leaned back, folded my arms, and told him that Banks never cooked for him at holidays or stood up for him when his college applications nearly fell apart. Banks did not share a last name or childhood, yet Banks still demanded responsibility. And if he could not accept that his sister was finally acting with the same standards, then maybe he should learn what it felt like to negotiate with strangers instead of family. They accused me of trying to steal his house, of plotting some backhanded scheme, and his girlfriend Karen whispered loudly enough for me to hear that I was jealous, that I had probably been waiting for years to punish Luke for getting more attention. I ignored her completely, because she was not the one on the title, not the one facing creditors, and not the one my parents were trying to use as a shield. Instead, I pulled out a folder with a draft agreement I had typed up after my meeting with the loan officer and explained that if Luke wanted my help, here were the terms: a promissory note in plain language, a repayment schedule, and a lien recorded against the property so that if he defaulted, I had recourse. I explained each line slowly, not for their approval but for their understanding, because I was done playing the role of the accommodating daughter who shrugged and said, "Fine," while everyone else walked away unscathed. My father scoffed, saying families do not drag each other into court, that paperwork like this poisoned relationships, but I reminded him of his own words, the countless times he had said paper beats feelings when it was in his favor. If he could use that line to justify closing deals at work, then he could hear it thrown back at him now. My mother called me cold. I told her being cold was safer than being exploited. Luke sighed dramatically, muttered that I was making things harder than they needed to be, and reached for the pen because deep down he knew he had no better option. And in that moment, I felt a strange calm settle over me, Not because I enjoyed holding power, but because I finally realized that for once I had leverage. The pen in Luke's hand trembled slightly, and I could see the flicker of realization on his face that maybe this time there would be consequences he could not charm his way out of. For the first time, he actually read what was in front of him instead of just scribbling his name and assuming someone else would clean it up later. My parents sat in tense silence, and Karen rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might stick, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that the balance of our family story was shifting, and I was the one steering it. When Luke finally set the pen down on the table, the paper signed with his name in ink, I knew I had forced them into a corner they never imagined I could build. And I also knew that the real test had not even begun, because signing a promise and keeping it are two very different things. And that is when I told him, slowly and clearly, that what he had just signed included a clause he might not like, one that would activate if he missed 2 payments to me. The look on his face was priceless, confusion mixed with fear, and I did not smile, I did not soften it, I just said the words as calmly as possible so they landed with weight. Luke picked up the pen, and for the first time in our lives, I watched him read. Once the ink had dried on the promissory note and the lien was prepared, the dynamic in the house shifted in ways that none of us could have anticipated, because suddenly Luke's charm, which had previously smoothed over every mistake and deflected every consequence, collided with a set of rules that were no longer negotiable, and my parents, who had always positioned themselves as the final arbiters of fairness, realized that they had inadvertently created a situation where I held the authority. Not because I was louder or more insistent, but because I had taken the time to understand the mechanics of responsibility in a way they had never bothered to explain to him. I spent hours coordinating with the county recorder, ensuring that the lien would be enforceable the moment any payment was missed, and I had drafted a clear, unambiguous default clause that left no room for misinterpretation, which was exactly the opposite of the verbal promises they had always used to justify their favoritism, and by the time I finished, I had created a framework in which Luke was no longer shielded by charm or excuses, and my parents had no way to interfere without exposing themselves to the very rules they pretended to respect. The first few weeks after the agreement were almost peaceful in their tension, as if the house itself had sensed the shift and paused, waiting to see whether anyone would break the newly established order, and Luke made the first payment on time, likely out of shock and uncertainty rather than a genuine understanding of consequence, and he even muttered something about how strict I had become, to which I replied simply that I was not strict, I was deliberate, and that my actions were designed to ensure that promises were not empty, because in this family, promises had historically been used to manipulate, and I was no longer participating in the manipulation. My parents watched this unfold from the sidelines, offering cautious praise that never quite reached their eyes, because they were both aware that the control they had once exercised through guilt, charm, and selective encouragement had been neutralized by nothing more than paperwork, deadlines, and clear legal definitions, and the power dynamic in the family had irrevocably changed in a way that was subtle but absolute, leaving each of us navigating an entirely new hierarchy that no one had planned for or wanted to admit. When the second payment came due, however, the reality of responsibility began to hit Luke in a way he had never experienced before, because he had spent the intervening weeks ignoring the full implications of the lien, assuming that some combination of parental intervention or a quick apology would suffice to erase any mistakes, and when the payment arrived late, I had no choice but to follow the exact terms outlined in the document, which meant delivering a formal notice of default in writing. Calm, unemotional, and procedural, and I copied both of my parents on the communication so that there was no ambiguity about who knew what, when, and why, and I refused to soften the language or provide excuses, because softening would have undermined the entire system I had built and reverted the family back to the old cycle of excuses, blame, and forgiveness without consequence. Diane called me that evening, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and fear, insisting that I was being too harsh and that family should be more understanding, but I reminded her that understanding had limits, And that years of being the responsible one while Luke faced none of the real consequences had already exceeded any reasonable threshold, and I explained, without raising my voice, that the document they had signed in support of the arrangement gave me the authority to act precisely as I was acting, and that any deviation would have been negligent on my part, because I had obligations to the structure I had set up. Not just to my own sense of fairness, but to the financial realities of the agreement and the potential damage to my credit and future if I allowed him to continue without accountability. Mark, predictably, tried to interject, suggesting that perhaps a conversation at the kitchen table would solve the issue, but I reminded him that conversations had been insufficient for decades and that clear, enforceable terms were necessary when verbal agreements had repeatedly failed, and that the lien and the formal notices were not punishments, but protective measures designed to prevent further chaos, and if they chose to view this as cold or harsh, that was a reflection of their prior choices, not my intentions, because I had spent a lifetime absorbing consequences that were not mine, and now, finally, the responsibility was being shared fairly, according to the document they had agreed to. Luke sat silently, looking at the notice, realizing that the game had changed and that I was no longer a passive participant willing to fix his mistakes behind the scenes, and for the first time, he actually read every line, every clause, and every date, understanding the seriousness of the commitment he had made, and I watched the moment unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that leverage alone was not enough, that consistency, follow-through, and adherence to the rules I had set were what truly shifted the balance of power in the family, and that for the first time, consequences were real, measurable, and inescapable. And that the same parents who had always relied on my compliance now had to accept that their expectations would no longer be met without adherence to the structures I had imposed. The house, once a symbol of favoritism and careless gifting, had transformed into a tangible tool of accountability, and I was the one who wielded it not with malice, but with clarity and purpose, enforcing boundaries and demanding consistency in a way that left no room for manipulation. And as I sat back and observed the initial ripple effects of this new order, I realized that the first major step toward fairness had been achieved, that my leverage was now real, and that my family had no choice but to recognize, however begrudgingly, that the rules they had always ignored were finally being applied evenly and deliberately, and that I had done it without anger, without theatrics, and without ever raising my voice, because power, when exercised precisely and intelligently, required nothing more than clarity, patience, and adherence to the principles that had been denied to me for far too long. The family meeting was something I had anticipated would be uncomfortable, but it quickly became clear that discomfort was an understatement for the tension in the room as my parents and Luke attempted to navigate a new landscape where I was no longer merely a participant in their carefully maintained narrative. And I realized that the balance of power had shifted entirely because for the first time I was holding authority through documents, deadlines, and enforceable terms rather than relying on patience, endurance, and the hope that my brother would somehow absorb lessons without consequences, and this shift made my parents visibly uneasy, as if they had just realized that the leverage they once wielded over me through guilt, comparison, and favoritism had been neutralized by the clarity of a few carefully drafted pages that now governed every action in the house. They wanted a summit at the kitchen table, a place that had always served as neutral territory for family discussions, where words were traded freely and where my role had traditionally been to absorb conflict and smooth over tensions. But I insisted that we meet at a neutral location, away from the comfort of familiar surroundings, so that the gravity of the situation could not be diluted by habitual settings or past assumptions, and I arrived with printed statements, a carefully organized timeline of payments, fines, and responsibilities, and an explanation of the legal consequences that had been established through the lien and promissory note, all of which left no ambiguity about what was expected, what had been agreed upon, and what would occur if anyone failed to adhere to the terms. Luke attempted to assert his typical charm, smiling nervously and trying to deflect responsibility by pointing out how the HOA rules, city fines, and short-term rental complications were minor and could be resolved with minor adjustments. and he implied that my insistence on formal processes was unnecessary and excessive, but I countered calmly, explaining that years of informal resolutions had consistently left me bearing the cost of others' mistakes and that the structured approach I had implemented was designed precisely to prevent such inequities from continuing, and that if he had respected deadlines, obligations, and the straightforward consequences outlined in the documents, none of this would be necessary. Which forced him to acknowledge, at least internally, that his prior strategies of charm and avoidance were no longer sufficient in this environment. Karen attempted to intervene, suggesting that I was being controlling, that I had no right to impose rules beyond my own financial concerns, and that the measures I had introduced were overreaching and unnecessary, but I explained that the lien, repayment schedule, and structured oversight were not personal attacks, but protective mechanisms intended to ensure that commitments were honored and that financial damage did not extend beyond what had already been accrued, and I emphasized that in this system, everyone's interests, including Luke's, were being safeguarded precisely because adherence to agreements was now transparent and enforceable, and not reliant on subjective interpretations of fairness or casual promises that had repeatedly failed in the past. My parents attempted to interject multiple times, offering vague assurances that family loyalty should supersede formalities, that we could find a compromise, or that I could relax my requirements for the sake of harmony. But I reminded them of their own philosophy, repeated countless times over the years, that paper beats feelings when it comes to accountability. And I explained that the same logic they had applied to business decisions and workplace negotiations needed to apply here if they wanted to maintain consistency, and I made it clear that deviation from the agreed terms would compromise not just my position, but the structural integrity of the entire resolution, leaving no room for exceptions or emotional leniency. During the meeting, I walked them through each clause of the promissory note and lien, highlighting the automatic triggers for missed payments, the collateral provisions, and the process by which any default would be executed, and I remained neutral in tone, never raising my voice, never allowing emotion to dictate the discussion, because I understood that demonstrating calm confidence and adherence to principles was far more persuasive than any argument based on frustration or anger, and I could see the realization on their faces that I had not only anticipated every possible objection, but had created a framework in which they could no longer manipulate outcomes or evade accountability without visible consequences. Luke's expression shifted from annoyance to apprehension as he recognized that his previous methods of sidestepping responsibility were now irrelevant, and when he glanced at the timeline of payments, fines, and the formal default clauses, the weight of his obligations became apparent, forcing him to reconcile with the reality that this time there would be no rescue, no apology sufficient to erase consequences, and no parental intervention that could override the structural safeguards I had put into place, which was a dynamic he had never encountered before and one that made him visibly uneasy as he considered the implications of every action moving forward. By the conclusion of the meeting, I had presented an alternative that was fair, enforceable, and protective of everyone's interests, including Luke's ability to remain in the house, while simultaneously ensuring that my own financial security was not jeopardized by his continued mismanagement, and I required commitments from both parents and Luke that adhered to the structure I had established, including automatic payments, adherence to HOA rules, cessation of unauthorized rentals, and acknowledgement of the formal collateral, and I made it clear that failure to comply would trigger the mechanisms already documented without the need for further discussion, intervention, or negotiation, leaving no ambiguity about the consequences of noncompliance. As I left the meeting, having laid out all of the terms, enforced the structure, and ensured that my leverage was absolute without ever resorting to theatrics or anger, I could feel the shift in the family dynamic settling into place. Because the balance had irrevocably changed in my favor, and while my parents and Luke had initially assumed they would be guiding the resolution, they were now fully aware that the control rested with me, that their prior methods of manipulation and expectation were no longer effective, and that any attempt to circumvent the rules I had imposed would result in immediate, enforceable consequences, leaving them with no alternative but to comply and accept the reality that the family hierarchy had been rewritten, and that I was the one determining the terms and enforcing the boundaries with a precision and calm they could neither influence nor ignore. On my way out, Mark leaned slightly toward me and said, almost as a challenge, that I would not really follow through with the strict terms I had outlined, and I replied simply, without hesitation, that they would see exactly how far I would go, because fairness, enforcement, and accountability were no longer negotiable, and the framework I had implemented would execute itself if anyone failed to uphold their commitments, which left him staring at me with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant acknowledgement, knowing that for the first time, I had transformed the family's expectations into enforceable reality, and that there would be no retreat from the system I had established. The final act of this long, carefully measured process began with the realization that my family had no concept of boundaries when it came to leveraging my sense of responsibility. And the quiet victory I had been orchestrating for weeks hinged not on confrontation or anger, but on the precise enforcement of rules, documentation, and accountability measures that none of them had expected me to apply so rigorously, which meant that every conversation, every meeting, and every signed agreement leading up to this moment had been setting the stage for a resolution in which I would emerge not only financially protected, but strategically in control, ensuring that my brother could no longer manipulate circumstances while I absorbed all the risk. When the scheduled date for the final payment arrived, I reviewed the timeline meticulously, confirming that all funds were accounted for and that the automatic transfers I had insisted on were processed correctly. And as I watched the last dollar move into my account, I felt a level of satisfaction that was entirely separate from vengeance or vindictiveness, because the brilliance of the plan lay in its precision and inevitability, demonstrating that accountability could exist without drama. Consequences could be enforced without malice, and leverage could be exercised without losing moral clarity, which was a realization that my parents and my brother had only now begun to comprehend, though they would not admit it openly. Luke, confronted with the full scope of his obligations throughout the process, finally understood what it meant for responsibility to be concrete rather than abstract. And his gestures of compliance were no longer performed out of charm or coercion, but out of necessity, as the legal and financial structures I had established dictated his actions and left no room for deviation, manipulation, or delay. And it was in that realization that he first expressed genuine recognition of the effort, planning, and forethought I had invested in ensuring that the house he had been gifted did not become a vehicle for further financial recklessness or familial discord, which meant that the dynamic we had all grown used to, where I absorbed consequences silently while he faced none, had been irrevocably altered in a way that allowed me to regain agency over my own life. Throughout this period, my parents oscillated between attempts to assert influence, veiled expressions of disappointment, and subtle appeals to emotion, all of which I met with steady consistency, pointing them back to the agreements they had signed, the conditions they had approved, and the procedural requirements that I had painstakingly implemented to protect not only my own credit and financial well-being, but also to create a system in which their son could learn to navigate responsibility without continually relying on parental intervention or the silent labor of his older sister, and I was conscious at every moment that the leverage I held was built entirely on fairness, clarity, and enforceable agreements, leaving no opportunity for the manipulation, guilt-tripping, or favoritism that had defined our family interactions for decades. The final move was executed with an intentional quietness that magnified its impact, because I coordinated with the escrow office to release the lien automatically upon confirmation of full repayment, ensuring that the enforcement mechanism I had relied on would conclude without the need for confrontation, public displays, or personal negotiation, and that the transfer of responsibility back to Luke would be both seamless and irrevocable, providing him with the house he had received while simultaneously marking the first occasion in which he had experienced accountability in a concrete, unavoidable form, and my parents, witnessing the procedural completion, were forced to recognize, whether silently or reluctantly, That the structure I had implemented had achieved what years of verbal persuasion and emotional appeals had failed to accomplish, which was to establish a permanent framework of consequence and fairness. I insisted on finalizing the conditions surrounding the house, including the termination of the short-term rental arrangement that had triggered city fines and HOA disputes, requiring formal acknowledgement from Luke and Karen that all activities must comply with established regulations, and I coordinated directly with the property management and local authorities to confirm that any future violations would be addressed immediately and in accordance with the agreements, eliminating the historical pattern of informal resolutions that had repeatedly placed me at risk, and demonstrating that enforcement could exist without overt hostility or drama, yet be absolute in its effect, which was a lesson in practical brilliance that my family had never been able to internalize until confronted with the unassailable structures I had put in place. When the final confirmation of full repayment arrived and the lien was set to release automatically, I did not celebrate loudly or seek acknowledgement. Instead, I allowed the quiet weight of accomplishment to settle over me. Because the true victory lay in the fact that I had reclaimed control over my own financial life, restored balance within the family dynamic, and demonstrated, through precise planning and steadfast enforcement, that fairness could be achieved without resorting to anger, confrontation, or melodrama, and that the leverage I had exercised was both morally and strategically sound, leaving no lingering ambiguity about the responsibilities, consequences, and boundaries that now defined our interactions, which was the culmination of weeks of deliberate, careful action that had transformed years of imbalance into a lasting resolution that all parties could recognize, whether they fully admitted it or not. As I finally sat back and reviewed the completed process, I understood that the lessons imparted by my parents over the years had been both flawed and instructive, because while they had consistently relied on manipulation, favoritism, and emotional pressure to maintain control, I had absorbed the essence of their teachings, translated them into enforceable structures, and applied them in a way that preserved my own interests, enforced accountability, and reshaped the family dynamic in a way that would have lasting impact, ensuring that for the first time in our shared history, responsibility, consequences, and fairness were no longer abstract concepts, but tangible realities that could not be ignored or circumvented. And in that quiet finality, I recognized the brilliance of executing justice with precision rather than spectacle, and the profound satisfaction of winning on terms I had set, entirely on my own.